مرحبا. هنا هم الخير. أين خليد الفقراء؟
يطا.
ياتا؟ وين ياتا؟
تقعد هون بس عدنا نجي.
They destroyed the well of water for one reason, just for one reason. Make Bedouin get out of this land. And we will stay here. If they destroy it, we will return and build a new well. Every time want to make our life miserable. The settler come here and prevent us and the children from swim here.
How did they do this?
They by their gun.
Okay.
They fear the children, like this.
How long didn't use this tool anymore? For how many
From
years?
6 years.
6 years.
Yes, from 6 years.
So again, where are we?
We are now at the military area. Here the Israeli camp for this area for trainer. They make this land as an experiment place for their bombs.
Look to this land, maybe like it's like oil.
Burn line.
It's like oil, maybe chemical weapons.
They, by these methods, they killed the grass here, and no way for life, for animal, for human. Finish. That's enough.
When did this happen? When did they use these weapons here?
Just in spring
Just in spring,
and winter. الشتاء والربيع.
maybe winter. A lot of times the Israeli soldiers come here and destroyed his bombs. Yeah.
So did you use this land before?
Yes.
For animal and you, and it's prevented for me to cross here. If the IDF come here, ask me where is your card, why you come here.
How many times make here? And this is the
He ask you everything, and after that maybe in some cases they take or they took the car to Kiryat Arba station, and you should pay money
To the soldiers?
to prevent you next time to come here.
to stay with me, to give it to my sons. This is our land. This is my fatherland.
هاي فاتح الشباك، فاتح شباك البوابة.
ارفع الحفله كتبوا 300 بتفرجوا وخمسه بضربوا. ان شاء الله بضرب الغاز كله ورا عليكم.
متعود ترجع شو استفدت؟
So I volunteered my services as a student with a bit of time. I applied for funding from a society called the Royal Society for Asian Affairs in London, and they gave me a very generous grant, and I booked my tickets to Tel Aviv, and that's how I came to Gaza this year. So I actually only spent 1 week in Gaza due to the political situation here at the moment. I arrived in Israel in the middle of July 2014. There was a lot of unrest in the West Bank. I stayed in Bethlehem and Ramallah, and every night there was army activity on the streets, a lot of convoys during the day, moving around, arresting people at night, and a lot of checkpoint restrictions, so there are heavy traffic jams when I arrived in the West Bank. When I moved to Gaza, I eventually got my permission to cross into Erez, into Gaza. I spent about 5 days in Al Shifa Hospital, which is a government hospital. The conditions there were frankly very poor. Compared to, say for example, Ramallah Hospital, they were markedly worse. The doctors in Al Shifa, as far as I'm aware, have not been paid in 3 months. So this kind of creates lack of motivation amongst staff, a lack of morale. So you could noticeably see that. In combination with that, there's shortages of basic medicines. For example, one medication we use for gastritis is very, very cheap and commonly available in the United Kingdom, yet it was rationed in Gaza to the point where instead of a 3-day course for this condition, they could only afford to give the patient 1 day and give them a prescription to go and buy the rest of the medications from the pharmacy. Now in Gaza, especially in the public hospital, the government hospitals, people don't really have spare money to spend on medications, and if they are sick, they will be forced to have an out-of-pocket payment, or they will be forced to borrow money off relatives, and the problem with this is that pushes people into poverty. So those are two big things that I noticed. Health workers aren't getting paid, and medicines aren't coming into the country. There are many other problems in Gaza with the hospitals. It's hard to say exactly, but the health workers there report corruption, missed payments, money going astray. When you talk about civilians, it's a military term, and it's quite appropriate to use in Gaza because the conditions are best described as siege. The Gaza Strip is surrounded by a fence, and whilst I was there were increasing amount of troops on the border with Gaza, and the civilians, I suppose there's a sense of resilience. I guess there's probably some insecurity. Every night there's bombs dropping, and I suppose the Gazans never looked twice, or never reacted to explosions. So they're very used to it. I wasn't used to it so much. The conditions of civilians on the streets. I visited Jabalia refugee camp, and there's people who live there with very little money, below the poverty line, below $2 a day. They rely on foreign aid. It's evident. You can see sacks of flour from USAID and from the United Nations. They have very little opportunity for work. The unemployment in Gaza is over 60%. Despite this, people are very well educated. It has one of the highest literacy rates, I suppose, in the world. Many young people go to university. and they're graduating without a chance to work. So one of the things I noticed amongst people our age, in their 20s, they're desperately trying to get out of the country to work, whether it's in the Gulf countries or in the US or Europe. Um, they are always asking about opportunities to get away from Gaza, and they're always learning new languages, English and German especially. I was there for 1 week, and the conditions that I saw in Gaza City were almost comparable to West Bank towns. In saying that, I spent a day in Jabalia refugee camp, and it's evident that people there don't have work, they don't have expendable income, they're living day to day, week to week, they're relying on external aid. The good thing about Gaza is, I suppose, that it's supported by United Nations Relief Works Agency. At the same time, um, basic things don't get into the country, and I notice things like medications not getting into the country, but there's other things that are really important for health and for living as well, like concrete. They just simply does not get into the country.
There's a blockade
There's
on construction materials
exactly,
as well.
Exactly. So there's a blockade on construction materials. It's very evident. If you go down to Gaza Seaport, they're half finished building the road because they don't have tarmac and they don't have concrete coming in. They don't have fuel coming into the country. Their last shipment from Qatar came a few months ago, from what I've heard, and the next one they don't know when will come. So in the hospital where I was working in Al Shifa, they had 20% of their capacity for fuel, and they were running low. And they need this fuel in the hospital for electricity generation. The national grid didn't have enough fuel, and they had to cut supplies of electricity to the sewage treatment facility, which results in raw sewage being pumped into the Gaza Sea. These are the conditions that Gazans have to deal with. Electricity shortages, food shortages, medication shortages, and they're very real, and they're challenges that people face every day, but they seem to deal with them at the minute. I would say Gaza is running from crisis to crisis, and they just about stay above the water, above the waterline, you know. They're kind of like a drowning man who's being dipped down in each crisis and just being raised to the surface. Compared to the West Bank, there was not the same sense of unrest on the streets. However, the points of the Gaza Strip where you have unrest tend to be in the refugee camps, as you would expect, and towards the border. So in places like Beth Hanun and Khan Yunis, there were quite a lot of incidents where the IDF came into contact with people who were allegedly firing rockets into Israel. Every time, every night that this is happening, the next day it's reported, it's the subject of conversation amongst everybody. Everybody there seems to be expecting a third intifada. They're ready for an intifada.
What do you mean by they're ready for an intifada?
When you speak to Gazans about the possibility of an intifada, they know, they expect it's going to happen. And when you talk to them about the intifada, they're not afraid of an intifada happening. You don't get that sense that they're afraid of it happening.
Do you feel what you saw there matched the mediatic depiction people get in the Western countries?
Okay. When I arrived, I thought Gaza would be hell on earth, and I was surprised that, in fact, it was a very friendly, welcoming country where things work. You know, it works like any other city in the Middle East, except it's just on the edge. I was so I suppose I was surprised by the media depiction that the ideas that I have about Gaza are Qassam rockets and Hamas terrorists on the street. You do see Hamas on the street. You hear Qassams going off, and you hear IDF bombs going off, and these things, whilst I was there, were not covered in the British media accurately. In fact, in the BBC, there was no coverage of the bombing of Gaza for the week that I was there until the very last day. If you look at other British media outlets like the Guardian newspaper or the Independent, they have journalists embedded in Gaza, and they do cover the story quite well. They also cover it from the Israeli side. They were publishing photographs whilst I was there of troops amassing on the border, and they were publishing photographs of buildings which had been destroyed by F-16 and military drones. So they were showing it to a certain extent. If you follow Twitter and social media, you get both sides of the spectrum. I follow IDF and I follow Gaza Writes Back, and I follow lots of individual commentators from both sides, Israel and Gaza, and you get completely different narratives. One narrative, the Israeli narrative, is that they attack only military installations and militants, which, as far as I can tell, seems to be fairly accurate. Say, for example, they say they targeted 15 Hamas military points in one night. You could bet that 13 out of 15 would actually be military, and perhaps 2 of them would be civil. For example, the Bank of Palestine was destroyed while I was there, one branch of the Bank of Palestine, and another building was destroyed, which was a telecommunications building. So I guess in terms of warfare, Israel are targeting Hamas military structures, but they're also getting some collateral damage. The reports from Gazans and from international solidarity activists tend to focus on injuries. They report injuries which actually tend to be serious injuries. Whilst I was there in Khan Yunis, a pregnant woman was injured and a child was injured, and I believe that he had some kind of traumatic amputation. These things are reported by both sides. It's hard to verify them, especially on social media, and that's when you look to your national press like the BBC and to the Guardian and to the Independent from Britain, but also from other countries. It's important that Spanish media, Italian media cover this, American media, because yes, the English-speaking countries tend to have a lot of people on the ground in the West Bank and to a lesser extent in Gaza, but you rarely meet non-English speaker journalists. So I think that's one area where we still have an opportunity to do some proper media reporting.
Do you feel that both national mainstream reporting and independent reporting actually make a difference? I mean, the impact at the end of the story on people in the West, is it there?
Yes, there is an impact. As far as the strength of the impact is unclear. In July 2014 this year, there was quite a lot of demonstrations across the world from the international solidarity movement. The impact they have on politicians is small, but I suppose important. They lobby politicians. They have politicians who bring questions into the British Parliament, into the Irish Parliament. In Europe, they've had an impact last year when many European countries decided to boycott goods produced in Israeli settlements because they consider the Israeli settlements as illegal under international law. This in itself is a success for the international solidarity movement, but the impact that this has, I'm not sure how strong that's going to be in stopping Israeli policies of settlement building and settlement expansion. Of course it's something, and in Gaza so far there's been very little impact because essentially the siege is still ongoing and if anything is worsening. But I suppose it's important to report what's happening there because if conditions do deteriorate as they are, if they do worsen, then an increased amount of humanitarian aid is going to be necessary there, and ultimately the only thing that will stop this is a settlement to the problem of Gaza, a political settlement, which is far off, but is the thing that needs to be done.
Between your last visit to Palestine last summer to the West Bank and this one to Gaza, did you feel that your perception of things changed drastically, and that your attitude towards media, towards information, changed as well?
I would say yes. Last year I came for 1 month. It was an introduction to the West Bank. This time I came for a month, and over the course of the year I've learned a lot more about what's been happening. I've read many different political commentators, from Edward Said to Noam Chomsky. I've read from Israeli media Haaretz and Plus 972, and I've read from Palestinian media Electronic in Fada. Has my opinion of media changed? Of course it has, as the digital revolution over the past 10 years has completely changed this conflict, I think. You have to take every article written about Palestine with a pinch of salt. You have to think about who wrote it and where it's coming from. There are, I suppose there's a wealth of information coming out of here, and you need to be critical when you read it. My perceptions of the West Bank have changed. It must be a firework. I perceive the West Bank as having worsened visibly this year, and I see that from the media reportage, but also from personal experience. Last year it was very stable in Bethlehem and throughout the West Bank until the end of August. This year, throughout the whole of June and July, things have worsened. There's a lot more agitation, a lot more unrest. It's hard to measure these things, but I guess you can measure them in injuries. You can measure them in nightly reports of people arrested. The numbers are increasing. The injury crisis is increasing. The numbers of Palestinian children detained without trial is increasing. The hunger strike, which lasted for over 50 days, didn't reach the international media. It barely reached the Palestinian people, in my view, and it's hard to say whether Palestinians themselves are apathetic about things here, but I suppose there are many different attitudes amongst Palestinians, from people who are ready for the third intifada to people who have something that they want to hold on to here and have some kind of livelihood. But I think in general most Palestinians are ready for an intifada.
بده يرمي احجار من جوا. يا حبيبي
I dislocated my shoulder. What happened? I was throwing stones and two guys got shot. One of them in his head. His head? Yeah.
ندعم